reading slumps suck, especially when on top of that they're paired with a bunch of mediocre at best books. Sadly for me, that has been the reality for the past 2 months. Despite starting the year off on a reading streak with 45 books read in the first 3 months, I have only read 11 books in the past 2 months. Anyways, without further ado, let's get into actually talking about these books, largely about what I didn't like about them, because there's a lot of things that I didn't like about these books. I do have some positives. There are some that are a bit higher rated than others, but overall I would encapsulate my experience of the past 2 months regarding reading as just mid at best. First book that I want to start off with is a book called A Soul to Keep. This one, you can probably already tell from the cover that it is a bit of an interesting book. It is a monster romance. This is the first time that I had ever read a book in this genre before, but I saw it as an audiobook at my local library and I was like morbidly curious about what was going on. And surprisingly, for the first couple of chapters, I was actually quite enjoying it. It was surprisingly a lot more wholesome than I was expecting. We're following a main character named Reyne, who is basically sort of sacrificed by her village to this monster called a Duskwalker, which are basically these sort of like shadowy monster type figures that have these like animal skull heads. For the most part, we're just like following them as they're sort of like settling in this house and like getting to know each other and like establishing a new normal of their life that they're going to now have to spend together. However, as the book started going on, there started to be more problematic aspects arising, and for me personally, the intimate scenes, to say the least, weren't my cup of tea, but that's not actually what I had a problem with regarding this book. What I had a problem with is that there is another character who our main character Rhea slut shames a lot. This slut shaming also leads to her blaming this character who is a victim of sexual assault for that sexual assault happening. In my opinion, really problematic. I have plans to do a video later on talking more so about some of the problems that I've had romantasy books that I've read, and this is one of the ones that I want to go more into depth with. So I'm just going to leave it at that for now. But yeah, really disappointed in this one because I do think there were some elements that actually made it surprisingly enjoyable that I wasn't expecting for something that is so outside of the norm of what I would typically read. Though the intimate scenes were a bit much in my opinion, but if that's something that you're into, like, that's totally fine. The more humorous aspect of my dislike of the book, because the other aspects that I had trouble with is a really serious issue. The next book that I read was one actually for a class that I was taking on children's literature, and it's called Hana's Suitcase, and it is a children's nonfiction book following the life story of Hana Brady, who was a young girl living in the time leading up to the Holocaust, who later died within the Holocaust. And this discussion of Hana's life is also paralleled with this school teacher and school children in Japan receiving a replica of the suitcase that she carried with her as she was torn from her home. So this was a really heart-wrenching and moving story, and I really enjoyed this one. I thought there was a lot of really interesting things to discuss in terms of memorializing the Holocaust and the lives of children during this time, and also the lives of children today. And I think that this book has a lot of really relevant discussions that are really important due to present conflicts that are currently ongoing in the world. And this is a YA fantasy book that is following a main character named Rora, who is a shifter. So the shifters in this world turn into different animals. Basically, there is some mystery illness going on. One of the princes of the nation that she lives in falls to this sickness, and him and Rora are really close friends, so she is really determined to find the cure to help him, which is what she's tasked to do by his father, who is the king. I really liked the world building in this one. I thought the shifters and the sort of exploration of that magic system and how it sort of connected to certain aspects of the lore within this world was really interesting and well done. However, I felt like the pacing and plotline sort of dragged in this one a lot, like a lot of other YA light fantasies. This one also had a romance subplot. I wasn't too keen on it. Basically, Rora is journeying with her brother and also the elder prince. There's some interesting aspects in their dynamic, but I wasn't fully sold on the romance that did develop between them. Honestly, I'm having a hard time kind of like remembering what happened because I just was bored by it. Not the most positive endorsement, but it still is, I would say, a solid book, and there wasn't anything problematic, unlike A Soul to Keep. The next one that I had read was Enchantra by Kaylee Smith. This is the sequel to Phantasma, which was actually one of my favorite books that I read last year. However, this one was a bit of a disappointment. I still did enjoy this one, but I felt like it wasn't as like fast-paced and exciting. Phantasma I read in one singular sitting and stayed up till 5 a.m. to finish it, whereas Enchantra took me a couple days to get through. This one picks up at the end of Phantasma, and we're following the main character Ophelia from Phantasma's younger sister Genevieve as she sort of sets off to try and figure out more of the mystery surrounding their family, following some clues that were revealed within Phantasma. And she sort of stumbles upon this like household called the Silvers, and there is some sort of trials competition that goes on each year between the Silver siblings. Genevieve ends up getting sort of entwined within this and basically is forced to marry one of them to have any chance at surviving it. So I did like their dynamic, but I didn't feel like it was as fleshed out as it should have been. With a lot of these like sort of romantasy books, I feel like the characters sort of go from 0 to 100 very quickly, and I felt like that was quite true for Genevieve and Rowan. But I'm still excited to see how this series progresses because there was some interesting lore revelations in it, and I still hold a soft spot in my heart for Phantasma. The next book I read was called Fireborne by Rosaria Munda, and this one is, I would sort of describe it as being like a more gritty version of Fourth Wing. We're following a main character named Annie who is living in this society where dragon riders used to rule, and the dragon riders were determined by royal bloodlines. Now that old order has been overthrown and a republic has been instituted, and Annie comes from one of the lower classes, and she was largely raised within an orphanage alongside another boy named Lee, who we find out rather early on is actually the displaced crown prince of the old order. And both of them are basically forced into this dragon rider school to compete for the position of the first rider. I think the world building and the lore was really cool, and I really liked the politics and court intrigue aspects of it. However, I wasn't fully sold on the characters and their relationship. I just never felt fully invested in the characters and what was going on with them, and I felt like some of the plot lines almost seemed a bit superfluous at times. But I do think that overall the themes and topics that the author was trying to explore regarding classism and other forms of discrimination was still well done. The next one that I read is called Eva Evergreen's Semi-Magical Witch. This is a middle grade series following a young witch named Eva Evergreen who goes on her sort of like witch's quest to become the next level of witch and to keep her magic. This one was really cute, and like, I don't know, I just wasn't fully sold on it. This book takes a lot of inspiration from the book Kiki's Delivery Service, and at times it just felt like it was repeating those same plot lines and felt very generic. However, it is meant for a younger audience, so I would highly recommend it for a younger audience because I think the author does a good job at still providing a good baseline story. It just wasn't enough depth to grip me personally. The next book I read was another audiobook, and it was called The Ragpicker King, which is the sequel to Sword Swordcatcher by Cassandra Clare. So I actually read Swordcatcher earlier this year and I really enjoyed this one. I did have some problems with the pacing of this book, but largely outside of that I really enjoyed it, and the same is true for the Ragpicker King. I actually think I enjoyed the Ragpicker King more, and I think of the books that I read this month does happen to be my favorite book. I really liked the way Cassandra Clare developed the story and also different aspects of the characters and their relationships with one another, and I'm really excited to see how this series continues. Though I do think there are certain aspects where this book seemed like it was like very meticulously plotted in a way where there was a clear delineation between Act 1, 2, and Act 3 that seemed a little bit unnatural, so the story didn't really flow as cohesively. That's just being a bit nitpicky, I think, because I think I'm just in a highly critical mood because a lot of the other books that I read around this time I wasn't enjoying. To give a brief summary of Swordcatcher, we're basically following these main characters named Kel and Connor. Kel is the swordcatcher, or sort of like a body double for Connor, who is the crown prince of the kingdom of Castellane. There starts to be these sort of political events that are going on behind the scenes that both Kel and Connor become involved in. There is also a tertiary main character named Lancaster, who is the granddaughter of one of the advisors to the royal family, who comes from a persecuted minority group that is based around Jewish heritage and history, of which Cassandra Clare herself is Jewish and takes a lot of inspiration from her own heritage and history to flesh out that world, and also Lynn's character and the world that she lives in. They all sort of slowly get involved in these greater political happenings. The next one that I read was another audiobook, and this was called Brighter Than Scale, Swifter Than Flame. It is a novella pitched as like The Mandalorian meets Chinese legend and history. I'd say to some extent that is true, because our main character has to wear this particular type of armor that is sort of similar to the Mandalorian TV show, where he is unable to take off his armor because of their cultural reasons. Our main character is a dragon slayer, and they are basically given the task of having to hunt down a very specific dragon that lives in this other nation where dragons are actually revered. Our main character has to journey to this island nation where she encounters the king, who is a woman, and slowly the two of them start to build a bond of friendship that devolves into a romance, as well as they're both sort of grappling with their own pasts and histories, and also how those histories connect to their present reality. Because of its short length, I felt like it didn't go into depth in a lot of the details, which I didn't really feel like I got a firm grasp of how the magic and worlds sort of were operating. It was sort of just more focused on how these characters were interacting with the world and with the magic, instead of actually giving some detail into what those things are outside of their characters and their relations to them, which is personally the way that I more so like world building to be. Comparatively, I thought a book like Swordcatcher actually did that better, in which the world building sort of existed outside of the characters, and it felt like more so that the characters were operating within a society more so than a society operating within the bounds to serve the characters better, which is what I felt this book was. However, I still overall enjoyed this narrative, and I think it's pretty solid for the length that it is, and I did like the romance between these two characters and thought that there was enough development there, though it maybe happened a bit faster than I would personally like, but that's more so because of the length than anything about the author's writing style. The next book I read was A Tempest of Tea by Hafsa Faisal. This one, I was sort of like excited for it, but I had also heard some not so good reviews on it, largely based on lack of in-depth world building, poor characterization, and lack of representation. I think for the most part I would agree. We're following these characters living in the sort of criminal underbelly. They run a tea tea house that at night turns into an illegal blood house that serves vampires. That premise really interested me. I was really interested in learning more about this tea house and blood houses and what the vampires were like in this world, and this book completely failed to deliver on any of that premise and instead follows this sort of like other heist plot line where our characters are sort of having to team up to like break into somewhere to get something, and I just didn't really care about it. I honestly would have rather had this book just focus on the characters running this tea shop, also seeing more about like what are blood houses and what do the vampires do in this world, and the book does sort of explore some of those themes, but I just didn't think it was as in-depth enough. I just felt disappointed. Like, I love tea and I love vampires, and I was like, please fulfill on the premise that you're setting up, but it just kind of fell short. The next one that I picked up is actually one that is for now Adina, but I probably will end up finishing it, and it is The Night is Defying by Chloe C. Peñaranda. I feel like I have talked about this book in this series a lot because I actually really enjoyed the first book, which is called The Stars Are Dying. This one I felt like just completely threw out everything that I liked about the first one and amplified everything that I didn't like about it. What I really liked in the first one was the world building, and I liked aspects of our main character. I didn't fully like her as a character, but she was tolerable, which is, I think, a pretty good compliment to be giving a romantasy protagonist, in my opinion. Others might disagree, but I find largely that they are not very tolerable characters. This one, I feel like she just had no character. I feel like the entire book just had no character, and there was like nothing going on. I don't really know how to explain things without like giving spoilers and stuff, but there is a lot of the characters reflecting on their past and also flashbacks to those past. I just felt personally that there was a lot of potential in this series that the author just didn't capitalize on in the right way, because in this book there's not really a lot that's happening, and then on top of that there's not really enough substance in the world at large to even make the story feel immersive, almost like you're wandering through a story without any sort of guide or like map to sort of help you to figure out what exactly is going on. And so it kind of just ends up feeling very superfluous and just not important. And I wonder if that might be because this is the second book in a planned to be trilogy, and possibly the author is just trying to drag out things instead of writing like a cohesive narrative, trying to get like, I'm not 100% sure on that, but I don't know, it just really fell flat in comparison to the first one, and just I'm not invested in the romance that's developing between the characters, even though I did actually enjoy it in the first book. So this one has just taken like 5 steps backwards rather than any meaningful progress towards coming up with a satisfying conclusion to the narrative that she started in the first book. This book is actually one that I read earlier in the year, but I didn't grab it at first because it was in a different spot, but it is When the Moon Hatched by Sarah A. Parker. This is probably one of the worst books I've ever read. I think at first it had a really intriguing premise, and our main character, Ray, working for this underground sort of resistance group that is rebelling against this sort of elite family that is basically kings and queens in the same family. It's a bit strange, but she's basically like supporting this rebellion by killing people who are corrupted within it, who are harming people who have less power than them. You know, I think that's pretty much like a classic like fantasy and romantasy subplot of like one character trying to care for people less fortunate than them. It wasn't like anything to write home about, but there were still some interesting aspects with it, and then obviously the cover and just the synopsis of the book as well also talks a lot about dragons, and you kind of get this impression that the dragons are really important to the world and the lore. You also get a couple of details about the gods in this world and how the gods correlate to the different magics that people have. However, the author doesn't do anything with that. And a lot of the time these bigger things like magic and world building and lore is changed to better suit whatever the author wants in a particular moment. And there is a lot of like criticism particularly towards this book about the writing style, and I 100% agree. Like, it is extremely overwritten to a point where it's honestly just borderline annoying, because the author will repeat the same sentence 2 to 3 times just using different words. It kind of like pads up how long the book is, but it's just like for no reason. Also, it's set in a world that is sort of medieval inspired, but they use a lot of modern terms. Like, at one point she uses the term microcop multiple times, and for some reason that really bothered me. It just seems like such a like TikTok brain rot type of word. It just feels so out of place in a fantasy book, especially one that is, you know, trying to seem bigger and more like inventive and fantastical than it actually is. And then this is also another one sort of similar to Soul to Keep that I want to talk more about in a different video. But another major issue that I had with this one is that it sort of is like underpinned by this notion of Orientalism, and I don't know if that 100% makes sense, but like Orientalism is usually sort of like the exoticization, particularly of Eastern cultures, and in this case of Middle Eastern cultures in particular, I would say are being exoticized. It kind of just made me feel really uncomfortable. I'm sure there's probably some other people who have talked about this topic a lot better than I'm talking about it right now, and I hope to, you know, when I film that other video, have more concrete thoughts on exactly what points of this narrative made me feel that way. But it just overall is like an uncomfy experience. I also feel like there was also a lot of undercurrents of sexism within it, even though we're following a main character who at the beginning of the book is established to have a lot of agency and be someone who acts against the social status quo to pursue what she believes in. But as the story goes on, we watch as those morals and her values slowly crumble away, and it's framed in a positive light. And it's never her that's fighting her own battles, it's the love interest, and we're supposed to think that it's romantic that he's doing all these things for her, but it's like she should be doing these things for herself for it to actually be like a story about empowering women. I don't know, it just kind of rubs me the wrong way. And I even heard some people talking about that the author was like, oh, this is like only the first half of what she had planned. This book and the second book were supposed to be the same book, so like this one doesn't even have like any sort of like a satisfying ending, and like the ending was also like a whole other thing as well. I really feel like this is just a straight up mess of a book, and I wholeheartedly agree with the people that don't like it. Speaking of books that I didn't like, I have yet another one, which is Under the Oak Tree by Suji Kim. So this is actually a novelization of a webcomic by the same name, and I had some positive opinions like going into this. I'd never read this webcomic before, but I'd heard online that people really liked it, so I was excited going into this. And then literally within the first like 3 chapters, they've had like intimate scenes together where she is like barely even consenting to being a part of those things. And this is something that continues throughout the rest of the book, is that whenever they're like being intimate in any way or just even romantic with one another, she's never like explicitly giving him consent to continue with what he's doing. The love interest in general is a very controlling person, and the ways in which he's controlling are very much romanticized by the author, who is like, oh, you know, he's being controlling because he cares about her, but how can you even say that he cares about her when he's stripping her of all agency? That's something that's, I think, especially bothersome in this book, because our main character is someone who's been abused and has gone through trauma and doesn't really know how to find her own voice. And there is also a lot of elements in which the character is sort of treated as like a child by other people who are having to teach her these things that they sort of are like, these are things you should know, but that she wasn't taught. Just really uncomfy because she's being like infantilized while he is like sort of acting almost as a father figure to her more than a husband. I really didn't like this one either, and now that I'm like talking about it, I think I actually hate it more than what I initially thought, because I have a soft spot for arranged marriage. We don't want to be married, you know, we're kind of forced into it, but they fall in love. That's one of my favorite tropes in books, is people not liking each other and then falling in love gradually. But this one kind of bastardizes that trope almost and just flips it on its head and almost makes it like just an icky version of it, because it's not about them coming to understand each other. It's about him almost molding her in a manner so that she is forced to understand him. Well, he doesn't make any compromises for her. That was the maybe 11 or 12 books that I read in April and May. Once again, these were not good reading months for me, and I hope that my reading is going to improve as the year continues, and hopefully June it will start to get better. Let me know if you have read any of these books and what your thoughts are on them, even if you disagree with me. Once again, thank you for watching, and goodbye!